Thanks for listening to High Education. I'm Amelia Day, lifetime educator and social justice activist, recording from my studio apartment. Today, we will be discussing what to consider when deciding to homeschool your kids, how to do it legally, and how to plan for effective lessons.
What should families consider when deciding whether to homeschool their kids?
There are many reasons why people decide to homeschool their kids, and among them, that's at the highest of that list right now, I would say, is probably COVID. We are living in a time where parents have to make decisions that are difficult about what is best for their kids, and sending our kids to school right now might not feel like the safest option for us. So, besides homeschooling, obviously, you can plug into the distance learning option if your school district is providing that. So, homeschooling might not be the best option for every family. And know that it's okay if you don't think that homeschooling is the right option for you. The distance learning is going to just continue improving as teachers gain more experience with it. And I do not believe that you are harming your child in any way by choosing to continue using public school. It's a great program, and I think that it's a great choice. But if you do want to know more about homeschooling your kid, here are the things that I think you should consider when deciding if it's the right option for you. One of the biggest commitments that you have to consider about homeschooling is the amount of time it takes. And it's going to be probably more time demanding if your student is older or has special needs, such as a reading disability, or any other learning disability. So just keep in mind that the time frame I'm giving is for a student that I'm working with. She is a kindergartner just starting out this year. And for me, it has taken about 5 to 10 hours of planning, 15 hours of instruction, and then a few more hours gathering supplies. So for me, it's about a 30-hour commitment. And that's with having teaching experience. So just be aware that it's going to be high intensity, especially if your kids are young or even in high school, because obviously they have higher levels of instruction going on at times for that grade level. So just be aware of the time commitment. The other aspect I want to mention is your personal dispositions. So, teaching obviously takes a lot of patience, and you might be like, well, I spend every day with my kids anyways, so I know I have the patience level to take care of them, but it's a whole new patience level trying to teach them things. So just be aware of your own disposition. If you feel like you are one who gets frustrated when things are not easy, which I admit I get like that sometimes, and I think we all do when we're tired. But like overall, just kind of take a survey of your disposition and decide whether it's something that would be healthy for you to do. And then your child's disposition, especially your relationship with them. Like, if you have a great relationship with them, you might decide that maybe homeschooling is not the best choice because you don't want to risk that relationship, or vice versa. If you don't have a great relationship, you don't want to make it worse by putting on more demands. So just really think about the relationship and whether it's worth adding this additional strain onto it, because it's not going to be easy all the time, and there's going to be challenges. The next thing I want to talk about is financial issues. Homeschooling is not free. You have to pay for the curriculum, you have to pay for your resources. They're not really cheap. So just look at your budget and be aware that there are free distance learning options. There's, I know in Oregon, they've been offering online public school for years. So you might look into that as an alternative because I know that finances aren't easy for a lot of our folks right now with job layoffs. Then ensure that you are at minimum meeting the standards of your state endorses. So it's easy to go into homeschooling like super excited because you get to control what you're teaching your kids, but just know that the reason states adopt standards is because they want to make sure at minimum our population know these things. And if you're not teaching that minimum, the specific standards that your state is requiring, then you are hindering your child's ability to be successful in life. If they aren't able to do what their peers are learning how to do by the time they graduate, they're not going to pass the GED. They're not going to have the skills that most employers expect of their population based on what the public school is turning out. So, knowing that you should meet those minimum standards, also be aware that you have an opportunity here to exceed those standards. That's what most teachers strive for. They don't want to just meet those minimum standards that the state requires, they want to ensure that they are getting their students the best quality of education as possible, and meeting the minimum is not the best. So you can always definitely include what your kid is interested in lessons. Include things that you think will be helpful for them in life. You don't have to just meet those minimum standards. And then I know that people choose to homeschool for religious or personal issues with things that are taught in public schools. So I want to address that when I'm telling you that you need to meet those specific standards. Because I know when it comes to science and some literacy standards that are upper level, it can be a little tricky trying to make sure that you're meeting your standards that you have to meet for your religion, and then also teaching the theories that you might not agree with in those standards. So maybe do some research. How often do those standards that you don't agree with showing up in the GED? How often are those standards showing up in any other required tests that your state requires of you? And then just make those personal choices for yourself, obviously, on how you're going to approach it. And then the next thing I want to talk about is research in teaching styles. So there's a lot of different theories out there on what is best for teaching. I'm going to go through the four basics, but know that there's a lot more, like Montessori. I'm not going to talk about that. Rosenblatt's theories on reading are really helpful. So, but they're not essential. I'm going to go through the four basic teaching styles, but know that there's more out there and you can definitely do research on those yourself, because this might not be what's best for your family. So there's teacher centered, direct instruction, student centered, and inquiry based learning. My suggestion is to create a learning environment that is student centered and inquiry based. And what that means is what you're putting in front of your student, your kid, is something that they're engaged in already. So making sure it's tied to their personal interests, and then you can meet the standards through those interests, and that it's inquiry based, which means that they are trying to discover the information for themselves. Studies show that students learn more, they retain more, and are able to use their knowledge better when they discover the information for themselves and if it feels relevant to their life. You know your kid best, so you can definitely cater to their interests. I would also suggest researching learning theories. It's best if you have a clear foundation on how people learn and how to help if there's frustration in the learning process, because it's never going to be smooth all the time. So, knowing Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and his scaffolding theory, Rosenblatt's transactional theory of reading, Piaget's theory of cognitive development, Bloom's domains of learning, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and many more will create that foundation that you're going to need stepping into a teaching role. And I will include links to this if you go to my website at highedpod.com, so that way you can quickly go through and learn what you need to. Obviously, it's going to be new information to you if you don't have an educational background. So, diving in and spending a week or two just really engaging in your own learning will give you the foundation that you need to make sure that you're meeting your kids' learning need. Yeah, so that's my suggestions on what you need to consider when deciding whether to homeschool your kid.
What legal hoops do families need to jump through to homeschool?
Well, because education is handled at the state level for the most part, every state is going to require different things for you to homeschool legally. And so I would highly recommend that you take the time to learn those requirements and make sure that you are meeting those requirements. Most states require, at minimum, that you inform the local school district of your choice to homeschool, and sometimes the state will also need to be informed in writing. To graduate, all students will need to pass the GED if they're not plugged into the public school district, or you can just go online and look at what the GED company has put out there for study tips. Many states also require students to pass the standardized tests that they're giving at different grade levels. I know California requires this. So just make sure that if you have a student who is in one of the required grade levels for that test, that you are finding out how you need to sign up to give your student that test, and that you are meeting the standards that are going to be on that test so that way they can continue in their education on time. Consider how long you plan to homeschool your kid. So, I would highly recommend not homeschooling your student if they are in middle school or high school and you're only planning on doing it for this year or the next 2 years, and then you plan to plug them back into the public school district. And that the reason why I say that is because middle school and high school operates on a credit system, kind of like the college level does. And they are very strict on how they accept transfer credits. So if you decide to take your sophomore out of the school and homeschool, and then when COVID's done, say junior or senior year, and you want to put them back in, well, there's a high probability that your school district's not going to accept any of the credits that she would have had to do her sophomore and junior year, and then she would be stuck back at sophomore level instead of getting to be a senior. So, I mean, I've seen this happen multiple times. There was a student who moved from Germany with his family to my town when I was in high school, and he was supposed to be a senior, and they put him in all freshman level courses because they wouldn't accept any of his credits from Germany. And it's not just something that happens because he's in a different country, but it happens at the state level as well, where I like my brother-in-law, he had to retake quite a few courses and just retake some state testing because he moved from Texas to California. So just be aware that if you're only planning on homeschooling for a year, that's not going to be a good option for a middle schooler or a high schooler. It's doable at the elementary school level, though, and that's where you need to definitely be in contact with the public school and show them your curriculum plan and your assessment plan in order to make sure that that school district is willing to accept what you're doing and is willing to place your student back in at the appropriate grade level. Just because it's working for me where I'm at to homeschool for a year as for the kindergarten student that I am taking care of, it might not work for you. So I don't want you to go based on what I'm saying right now and then be really frustrated when it sends your student a year behind. So just make sure that you are doing everything that you can to follow the legalities. Some states require more things than just testing. Some states require that you keep a log of all of your curriculum, that you are certified as a teacher. Not every state is going to require the same thing. So do your due diligence, do the research in the beginning to make sure that what you're doing is helping your kid and not making it worse.
What tips do you have for families on how to plan effectively for their students' education?
When you begin planning for your student's education, it's important to look at the whole child and not just the academic side of the child, because all of the child's experiences and behaviors are going to affect their academics. So, if you don't plan for these things, you've already created a weakness for yourself. So, by setting up your plan, as well as you can in the beginning, you're setting yourself up and your student for success. So, my first point of advice to make sure that whatever you plan is effective for your student's education is their behavior expectations. Be very specific in your expectations and teach them explicitly at the beginning of the student's experience with homeschooling so that way they know what is expected of them. If your kid doesn't know what you expect, they are less likely to meet those expectations, obviously. So, just teaching them it explicitly and following through on whatever consequences you're tying to those expectations not being met, following through with it consistently every time, especially in the beginning, is how you're going to ensure that you have a positive relationship with your kid as not only their parent, but as their teacher. And if you are inconsistent or you don't set up the expectations or you don't follow through with the consequences, your kid will not feel safe or respect your expectations. And this will affect their learning. They're probably going to goof off or argue more often if they don't know what you want, because there's going to be a communication issue there. The next point is the academics. So, like I mentioned before, just start with the standards. Print out your state standards. A lot of states are using Common Core, but I know that some states are not. So just learn what your state standards are and print those out, read through them, and then decide what you would like to add to those standards. Because, like I said before, you don't have to limit yourself to that, but it should be the minimum. You can write your own additional standards or look for some online or hire someone to do this for you. There's lots of different ways that you can improve on the state standards, but make sure that at minimum you are highly immersed in those standards, aware of them, and are ready to meet them. Once you know the standards, you can then start looking into your curriculum. I would suggest going to edreports.org, which ranks curriculum published by companies based on different factors such as usability, teachability, meeting the standards, and different things like that. So if you want to go on there, you can actually look at their rubric to know how they're grading the curriculums and figure out which one is best for your kid. I would look there first with your budget in mind. So some resources are going to be more expensive than others. So just know what you can afford as well. Luckily, I would say that the one that is in number one, like tied with another company, is EL Education, at least at the kindergarten level. It's completely free. It is proven through different case studies to be effective with all different types of learners. So there are free options or cheap out options that are also good out there. So it can be done as inexpensively as you can make it happen. Because even though EL education is free, you're going to have to print a lot, or at least have a computer available so that way you can see what you're supposed to be doing using the computer. Another resource that I would say is important to be aware of is knowing how you're going to assess your student, especially if they're like at the younger level and you need to know what reading level they're at. I use reading A through Z. They have a leveled reading library that's available entirely online that you can print from or just use the screen. They have assessments like running records, which is something that you'll need to learn how to do in order to assess your students' reading level. And then they also have different assessments for things like phonics and vocabulary available on there. So that way you can get a sense of where your students at. Because even though they're in second grade, they might be reading at a sixth grade level or they might be reading at a kindergarten level. So you can't assume that because they're in second grade that they're going to be reading at a second grade level. So learning how to use those assessments and knowing that you should assess them at least once a month to ensure that they are progressing and learning what the parameters are. So learning how much growth should you expect from your kid, because not everyone's going to grow at the same level, but everyone should be growing if your instruction is actually effective. So know your standards, know what curriculum you're going to use, and then know how you're going to assess their learning is the basis of what you should be planning. And different programs are available, not just reading A through Z. There's Fontes and Fennell, excuse me, and many other options. So I will provide that on highedpod.com, as well as you can just Google it. For math, I'm using Eureka's math resources, which is conveniently also free online. They have where you can purchase the printed versions of both EL Education and Eureka Math's resources. You can purchase them or you can just access them free online. And so, what I chose to do is I purchased the student edition of Eureka's Math's resources, and I'm using that for her assignments, but then I didn't purchase the teaching edition because I can access that completely online for free. And they're actually fairly inexpensive. I got all of the modules that I needed for a kindergartner for $40 for her math. And then with like EL education for the reading, you can make sure that are getting the books that it requires, because although the curriculum plan is free, they don't provide the trade books, like the books, the picture books for free. So you have to have access to either a library or an online library, or just know that you'll have to purchase those books. And then just make sure that you are aware of best practices for, at minimum, math, science, and reading. But I would highly recommend that you do your best to meet the other subjects as well, social studies and arts, especially. Um, so, the National Reading Panel report is available to read for free online, and they highlight the minimum best practices that are needed to teach an average student to read. They don't really address students with special needs or students who are English language learners in that report. So, if you have these specific needs for your student as well, you're going to have to do more research than if the student is a English native speaker or uh, just a average student. And so the National Reading Panel report highlights for reading that the aspects you should focus on the most is comprehension, vocabulary, phonics, phonemic awareness, and fluency. But I would argue that you should include motivation and independent reading as well, because even as the authors themselves of this report said, they were in a very tight time crunch with minimum resources available to them. So they didn't do the best job that anyone could do because of the parameters they were working in. So that besides that, once you have the curriculum and you've made sure that it meets your standards and you know how you're going to assess your student, know that you don't have to follow that curriculum 100%. I have never met a teacher who just does what's in the book 100% of the time and doesn't include other things and doesn't skip things. Like, we're all using our judgment as well as the curriculum to do the best we can for our students. So I would plan to use your curriculum as much as you can, but then know that you might need to supplement, and that if you see something in the curriculum that you're like, "Ugh, this is not going to work for my kid. I know they're just going to hate this part." Well, just skip that part and like include a different way to meet that standard. Following their scope and sequence map might be a great way to do that, because they'll have at the beginning of the curriculum most likely a schedule of how when they're going to meet all the different standards. And what you could do is you could take that schedule and then take the curriculum and follow it as much as you want, but then like take out the activities that you know are going to frustrate or bore your student, and just plug in a different resource to meet that same standard. Another thing I would suggest doing is having a weekly calendar and jotting down each standard that you're meeting on the days that you're meeting it. And then every few weeks, review what standards have I met through my instruction, what standards do I still need to meet, and which ones do I think I need to review. Because if you taught something in September and it's now November and you haven't reviewed that standard since, your student might have forgotten or be less capable of showing that they are understanding that standard because it's been too long since they've seen it. So, making sure that you are tying in reviews as much as possible, as well as just keeping on track. Know that you have to cover all of these standards throughout the school year. And whereas reading is kind of cyclical in how the standards go, like you're going to teach comprehension skills every single week. But in math, you're not necessarily going to teach those standards again once you've taught it like for that unit. So just making sure that you're reviewing is going to be essential. After that, I'm going to discuss how you're grading your student. So you are going to have to decide how you want to assess your student's ability to show that they have met each standard. And so you can decide that you're going to grade every assignment and take a daily grade on that. Like, what I do is I grade her, but I don't like write down the grade for every daily assignment, because what I see the daily assignments as more so is just practice with learning the standards. So I show her, like, I go through it with her and I show her which ones she got correct and which problems she got, needs more practice with. But then I don't like write down in a grade book every single assignment. What I do is I am creating a portfolio with writing samples in it of her best work each month. I am including uh, math samples. So for every single standard that I have to meet, I'm going to choose one activity that shows that she has mastered that standard, and I'm going to include it in her portfolio. So if it's like an addition standard, I'm going to pick her best work for that standard, and I'm going to include that worksheet or that test or whatever in her portfolio. That way, when she goes into second semester kindergarten, if the school opens, or first grade, if it doesn't open this year, I can just simply hand that portfolio to her teacher and show her that the student that I'm working with can meet the standard. You have to decide how you are going to prove that your student is meeting the standards. And yeah, you can decide to assign percentages or letter grades that might work best with your middle schoolers and your high school students. Whereas what I plan to do is I have a list of the standards, and I'm going to check mastered, progressing, or needs work for each standard as I assess her. And by the end of the year, hopefully she'll be in mastered for everything. But if not, then I can show what she needs to continue working on as she enters the next grade. And then after grading, you need to also think about how you're going to organize your lessons. So I'm going to provide an overview of how I have organized lesson planning, but just know that it could be really different than mine and still be a great system. Everyone's different. If you look at any two teachers, classroom management of their materials, if you look at any two teachers' management of lesson plans, they're going to have a completely different system. You're kind of like a manager at this point. And so you're going to create the system that works best for you. So the system that I use is I create a weekly bullet point list of what I'm teaching each week. And then I expand on this bullet point list using PowerPoint. It's not something that I engage my student with very much. It's more so it keeps me on track. So every day I'll have a different section of the PowerPoint, and I use it to make sure that I have everything that I need plugged in. So I'll hyperlink any of the websites that I plan to engage her with into the PowerPoint so I can quickly just click on it instead of spending precious instructional time trying to find the website again. I will also include it any notes to remind me of what I want to teach at that point. I'll also take screenshots of the curriculum's plans that I want to follow word for word and put it in there so that way I can read through it while she's doing a different assignment and remind myself of what I want to cover. So just make sure that you are creating the support that you need for yourself as a new instructor, using whatever system that works best for you. So, like I said, I use a bullet point list that has the vague lesson plans, but then I expand it and make it bigger for myself using PowerPoint. You can do anything like using a lesson plan book. You can buy a lesson planning book. They sell them at like Target and other places. I'm sure it's on Amazon. And if you go to teacherspayteachers.com, I'm sure you can find lesson plans on there. Just be aware that if you need to modify those lessons, you need to just look at what the publisher states you are allowed to do because there are copyright issues if it's not your own lesson plans. Um, like I'm pretty sure that most publishers won't mind if you modify it for your student as long as you are not like publishing it again, explaining how you modified it and trying to earn money off of that. They're going to get very frustrated if you do that. So just be aware of any copyright issues, but you're more than likely going to be fine in how you're using the resources as long as you're using it just for your students. Last, I want to point out that even though your student is not going to school in person, they still need socialization. So, however you feel comfortable doing that, you have to decide based on your student's health and your health and the health of your community what is best for you. But make sure that you're including at least a weekly FaceTime with some friends. And then even some families are having learning pods where they might come together for 1 or 2 lessons a week. My suggestion, if you decide to do that, do it in an outdoor place because we know that COVID-19 doesn't spread as easily when you're outside. Not to say it won't happen if you're outside, but we know that the likelihood is less if you're outside. And then continue your social distancing. So, have a plan for how you're going to make sure your students are not in each other's bubbles. Just teaching your expectations of how they should handle social interactions is going to be important before you put your student in that position, especially if they're younger. Um, because I do worry about the lack of socialization for homeschoolers, but just know that as long as you are engaging them with some peer socialization, at least through the screen at this point, you're doing the best that you can, and that those pods are an option if you feel like it's something that you are comfortable with, but don't do it if you are worried about being sick, if you have a student with underlying health issues, and all of that. If you enjoyed what we talked about, be sure to like and subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. Proceeds from this episode will be donated to Save the Children. You can learn more about how you can support us and what we talked about today by visiting us at highedpod.com. Next week, we plan to address how educators can ensure they are promoting justice in their classrooms and community for their diverse learners.